everyone, welcome to Filipino on the Rise. I'm Crystal Fabella, host and founder. I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you never miss out on new video content. You can find all episodes on most podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, Anchor, FM, and more. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Here's an opportunity for us as storytellers, as well as even just the Filipino community, to show solidarity with this community that's hurting right now. And this is absolutely something that is very, I think, low lift to help amplify their voices. In general, bigger, longer systemic changes do not happen overnight. They happen in these consistent steps, intentional actions that you have to take and strategize what makes sense and where can you as a person, as an organization, can best contribute so that you can maximize the most impact.
Welcome to the Filipina on the Rise podcast, where I spotlight Filipino women doing big things and making an impact. I'm your host, Crystal Fabella, and I aim to promote Panay excellence and celebrate what it means to be a Filipina. Today, we're talking to Leezel Tanglao. Leezel is a bridge journalist at the intersection of everything from editorial, product to audience development, marketing, and more. Currently, Leezel is a senior editor for membership and innovation at HuffPost. In the past, she's worked with the Associated Press in audience development and was at CNN Money as assistant managing editor of programming, where she led a global team of multi-platform editors. She received her bachelor's degree at Loyola Marymount University and a master's degree at UCLA. Leezel is a 2019 Filipino Young Leaders Program delegate and sits on their board of directors. On this episode, we talk about Leezel's journey into journalism and the lessons she's learned along the way about meaningful storytelling, the art of bridging communities, and how Filipinos can embrace their history of adaptability and being original innovators. She also shares with us the concept of blood debt and a new series she's working on to help us understand intergenerational indebtedness stemmed from an experience she had in her 20s. We learned how exciting it is to be many things, not just one, be a bridge from one world to another, and about reframing fear as opportunities for growth. Leezel and I recorded this in the beginning of February. Since then, the world has drastically changed. We had a global pandemic. COVID-19 and stay-at-home orders have changed everything from the economy, work, jobs, society, our basic way of living. On top of that, the movement against racial injustice and Black Lives Matter has been reignited after 3 more Black lives have tragically been taken at the hands of police brutality. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Protests and demonstrations have sparked nationwide, crying for justice and systemic reform. More importantly, it's forced communities of color to look at their role as allies and activists against anti-Blackness. Leezel and I reconnected recently on this, so stay tuned towards the end of the show as we cover these current events and how we as individuals and our Filipino American community can play an effective and meaningful role.
I'm very excited to have here today Leezel Tanglao. Can you say hello?
Hi, guys.
In your own words, who is Leezel Tanglao? What do you currently do, and what is your present mission?
So it's not a complex question, but it's definitely something that is an ongoing thing, I would say. I would say Leezel is very much many things. Presently, I would say in many ways, I'm a bridge to a lot of different things, not only personally, but professionally, being at the intersection of multiple industries, roles, as well as where I am in my life. So I think that's the best way I could describe myself currently. But I think identities are fluid in the sense that we occupy multiple spaces at the same time. I'm not just one thing, I'm multiple things. And I think that's a very beautiful thing. Currently, I would consider very much part of my professional identity as a journalist, a storyteller. I've been in this business for the last 16 years. I really can't imagine doing anything else, but I do envision myself kind of moving through different parts of what journalism is, and as a storyteller, what that might mean. So things that might be adjacent to it, like being like maybe a book author or other different types of storytelling. In terms of like mission wise, I think the past 2 years has really shown me, as well as like reminded me of what my core is. It's been challenging to say the least, just by nature of my industry. I mean, journalism and the media world is just in total disruption right now. So there's no safe place, I guess you can say. And I guess you can make that argument in any industry, but more in particular in my industry, where companies are shutting down, they're getting bought by other places, people are merging.
How
you
has it
know.
changed from the time that you went into it and where it is now? And I know you said it's been challenging, but it's been challenging your core and reaffirming your own core. So I'm really intrigued with that.
Yeah, I mean, like when I first started in the business, like first of all, like I think I did not have a linear path.
Mm.
And I knew I wasn't going to have a linear path, but I thought there would be at least some guideposts along the way. And there were in the beginning. Like I started out in the early 2000s and I went to a university for undergrad, Loyola Marymount University in LA. It didn't have a J school. And, you don't necessarily need, I think I would say I'm living proof. Like, you don't necessarily need a journalism degree to get into journalism. And there's nothing wrong if you do have one. I think that only helps you as well. But I had to really figure out what that path looked like. So from the very beginning, it wasn't linear because my university just didn't have, a program.
Yeah.
So during that time, it basically, I felt like I was forced to choose. Like there was like four paths, right? There was like broadcast, which is TV, radio, newspaper, which is print, and then also this thing they used to call new media, which is the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
New media.
New media is what they called it. I was like, okay. So as I did my internships and like went to job fairs, and for me, I love learning about different things. I didn't want to just stick to one thing, right? But like as I talked to these recruiters and they saw my resume, because my resume had a little bit of like print and as well as I interned at the PBS station in LA, they were just like giving me puzzled looks. It's like, okay, well, what is it? Like, what are you going to do? So I kind of felt like I was forced to choose a lane. And in the end, I went back to what I started with was like writing. So I started in print, in newspaper.
Wow.
And if you would have asked me in my first job where I would be now, I could not even imagine it because, I went from like being a reporter, then an editor, and then moving to online.
You've like conducted so many different roles within the reporting and journalism space. And I'm so intrigued about what being Filipina, how that played a role in this space, in this journey, if it has at all, or if culture has influenced your own experiences around this. But it just seems like almost from the very beginning, you had storytelling or journalism in your blood at a very young age. I'm guessing you just really dove into it. And was this always a passion? When did you first know that this was an area you wanted to be in? What were influences around that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really start thinking about it seriously until I got to college because you're just influenced by so many different things. And interestingly enough, like, I guess this is atypical of Filipino families or whatever, is that my family, all they really cared about is like to make sure, like, I finished school, push me one way or the other, like to become, the traditional paths of like medical or medicine,
Okay, so you didn't have that pressure.
I didn't. And I guess that's why I feel like I'm not necessarily typical of like other peers and other people I grew up with. And for that, I'm very thankful for it. Yeah. And I think I discover later on the reason why, because I think, with immigrant parents, obviously they want you to try to, be in a safe, careers, and those are usually the ones that they look to. But like, at least with my family, they just wanted to make sure I had the like finish school, whatever it is, finish school, and then you'll figure it out. So I had a lot of freedom in that sense, but it also was just kind of like, well, okay, well, what do I do? And ultimately, when I got to college, I was like, okay, this is very clear, and this is so stereotypical. You ask any journalist, is that I am just not good at math. I am just not good at math. So that basically canceled out all of those careers that depended on that. And like I said, you talk to any journalist, they'll probably say the same thing. That's just the running joke. So I figured, all right, well, I know what I'm not good at. Well, then that means I know what I am good at, which is like writing. So I figure, okay, well, what do I do with that? So I just basically kind of fell into it. I just started writing for the school newspaper. And then there's something about just seeing your first byline in print. Like, it's just an indescribable feeling. And I think from that point on, I just kind of fell in love
that feeling.
Love into it. Yeah.
Wow.
And it feels very stereotypical, but like in college, you kind of go through this awakening, like a cultural awakening. FONS, which is the Filipino American National Historical Society, like going to that conference, which happened to be on my undergrad campus that summer in 2002, really changed everything for me. Like, it really opened my eyes about just like our own culture, because, my own family just didn't really talk about it as much. Like, I knew I was Filipino. I knew, about the food. I knew about the cheesy, Tagalog films.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I didn't really know what it meant to be Filipino, I guess, American, if that makes sense.
A lot of people relate to that sense of, you're Filipino and you know what the culture is like, but getting to a place where you finally define what it actually means for yourself and appreciating that. So is that what you were enlightened to during that time? And then did it play a role in how you continued on in your career?
Yeah, 100%. I gave a commencement address to like the College of William and Mary for their Asian Am Studies program. I believe it was in 2017. It was a couple years ago. And I talk about this story where ultimately the question that did change everything for me came from like a friend of mine who was Vietnamese. And like, she was fluent and everything. And just one day she just asked me, why didn't I know Tagalog? And I don't know, for whatever reason, that rattled me. And I was like, yeah, why don't I know? And, part of it also, like, side note, like my family's not Tagalog. They speak Kapampangan, but still the same principle, right? And a lot of it also, like growing up, I grew up in a predominantly like Filipino community, but it wasn't always the most positive, if that makes any sense. Like it was very cliquey, and it just left me a negative attitude. Yeah. So I think that made me pull away from like learning about more. So it wasn't until like my friend asked me that question, I was like, well, yeah, why don't I know? And then coupled with going to that conference, it made me realize, well, I think it's wrong to just like, just think everyone's like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To your own culture and your being what Filipino is in a box.
Exactly. So then when I discovered, wait a minute, there's actually people that are not like judgy and cliquey and, oh my God, look at all these achievements. How come I don't know about this?
Exactly. And then it opens you up to like, oh, there's more to what like Filipino people are like. And
yeah. And that basically fueled my mission to continue to be a journalist and a storyteller, because once I saw all these stories, I'm just like, why haven't we heard more of this? So I just kind of made it my personal mission to make sure wherever I'm working, like whatever company, whatever role I'm at, like being able to tell these stories, not only about our own community, but other communities that never get covered is just so important. Because those things just live on way past, leave this earth. So
sure. I'm just really starting to dive into the power of storytelling, right? How it sustains the culture and community and what they've gone through. And having probably reported and told and done so many stories, like what does storytelling really mean to you? Like, why is it important that you do this work?
Largely for the community, right? I think it just gives a voice to folks that you don't normally see or hear. And especially for me in the last couple of months, I can't tell you how powerful it is when you feel heard, you feel heard, you feel seen. And that just resonates with you so deeply.
Yeah.
And for me personally, as a journalist, I think the greatest thing about it in telling other people's story in many ways, like you get to live life twice through someone else's eyes. Right. And that's such a gift that should be shared. And it's incredible. And again, like there's different careers that have a certain thing to it, but I think with just storytelling in general, it's just very special in that sense that like.
Yeah. Do you feel like, especially with Filipino history or people's and our experiences, looking back historically, we are underreported, whether in education or within media? Do you feel like you're doing bigger work that finally uncovers the stories that haven't been told for so long because we've been maybe dominated by Western media or dominated by like our histories?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the one story that still stands out in my mind was one of the stories that I wrote in my first job at the Press Enterprise newspaper in Riverside County, California. And this is
that's where I'm from.
Oh, okay. So you probably know. Okay. So because it's a local paper, you always kind of have to have a local angle to it. So the story I wrote, this is like right around when it was about the 40th anniversary of the Delano grape strike. Right. Okay. So what people don't realize is that there was another strike before Delano that made Delano possible. And that occurred in the Coachella Valley. So the Coachella Valley was really the test proof of concept, if you will, because the way the grape season runs, right, it goes from, I think it was south to north. I don't quite remember, but anyways, the season starts from like going from like Coachella and then going all the way up to Delano. So the Filipinos there, they staged a strike a couple months before they got to Delano in Coachella, and they actually won. They were paid those wages. So because of the success in Coachella, they decided to try to repeat that when they got to Delano. And through that story, I traveled to Delano. I talked to Paul Chavez, who is Chester Chavez's son, and got to talk to a couple of other folks that were around during the time. And,
Wow.
and it was a months-long story. It got on the front page. And it was just labor of love just to be able to tell that story, right? And I would say like maybe a week after the story got published, like I got, snail mail. I believe it was like an elementary school student. I don't remember like what grade, but she sent me a letter saying, I read your story about the Filipinos grape strike in Cesar Chavez. I would love to get more information. And to me, that is such impact. I mean, this is why,
This is why you do the work you do.
This is why I do what I do. And I still think about that to this day, like 16 years later. Like, impact, yes, can be like changing policy and all these big ramifications, but impact can be just as big as that, something like that.
Exactly.
And that's why we do it.
Absolutely. Just to reiterate what you said, we always think of impact as this big sweeping, movement. We're changing systems or institutions or culture, but impact is really so powerful when it just starts with that, youth, a child just saying, hey, thank you for writing this. This really sparked my interest in X, Y, and Z. And that's where movement starts to happen. And I'm sure that you've gotten that multiple times, but wouldn't you agree that the most powerful parts is when you reach that one person who, it's almost exponential at that point?
Oh, 100%. Like these days, I don't write as much because I'm now more on the strategy side of journalism. But like I wrote a story that just came out last week, and I don't know if you saw it. It was about, how the Filipino community is fighting against medical invisibility. And again, well, because even though like the irony of this all, right? You can find a Filipino in every medical office, hospital. Like there's no way you're not going to not find a Filipino there. But then there's not a lot of medical studies done on us, like specifically on us. Like, so we're like literally invisible, which is crazy. So again, like it's been like a year since I've written a story, but I felt like when I saw that story, I'm like, okay, I need to write this. I went ahead and did it. And, just to see it go viral in the community and just getting the feedback from people, like that was enough for me. I didn't care like how many page views it got or whatever, but just to see it even just being shared among like us, that's impact.
There's like waves of impact for that. I mean, I'm looking at this right now, and these are things I think about until it's brought to light like this. Like, wow, I never thought about the fact that we are so understudied, and even 1 in 4 Filipino Americans have high blood pressure. Yes, that is so true. Like I've heard like, at a higher rate than any other Asian group. And so why are we overlooking these kind of studies? And over here, this is interesting. Part of fixing this issue relies on the Filipinos community's willingness to be study subjects. So that might even open up like now people in our community wanting to participate and be proactive in this. So I know that you said that right now you're more on the strategic side. So can you describe like, I know that you're doing many things right now in the present, and you're not just one role, but being deputy managing editor for membership and innovation at HuffPost, really what that encompasses and maybe how you got there?
So they kind of changed the title. So it's actually like senior editor of membership and innovation. So like I would say my current role has been like, basically I've been kind of working my way into this because like I said previously, I started as a reporter editor, and then I moved over to online and did more homepage editing, and then moved towards more audience development, and then for this role, like they were really looking for someone to literally be a bridge between different departments, because this role really requires me to work in between so many different places. Even though I sit in editorial, I mean, I mostly am in meetings with product, engineering, marketing, the revenue side. So in order to be in these roles, you kind of have to understand obviously how editorial works, but also how to essentially be a translator between these worlds because they're so different, but yet we all work in the
you
same
speak
place.
to engineers and the way you speak to marketers or the way you speak to sales team, it's all different. So you're a cross communicator while you're being cross functional. So
right. And as I was like trying to find my next role and job interviews, they always ask you, tell me about yourself. And that's your chance to kind of tell what your narrative is. And I realized it just clicked in my head. I was like, because I was looking for these type of bridge roles. I'm like, wait a minute, I've always been a bridge person. Like as a child of Filipino immigrants, what did we do? Being born in the US, you literally are a bridge between your parents who came over here, who essentially some spoke the language, some didn't, but had to figure out what was life here. Whereas you were born here, what the culture is, but you're inherently still different, right? Exactly. So you really had to be that translator. And I realized, wait a minute, that is my narrative. You know what? I've been doing this all my life. Like, why don't I can use those skills in the current role I am now, where you literally need somebody to translate this between like a developer and editorial, like, you know what I mean? To make sure we're in alignment with whatever it is, right? So
I like that. This is what you've been all your life and being Filipino and American. And I think a lot of us can resonate with that of never feeling like one thing. And is that a bad thing? Or is the need and the ability to speak different, to communicate in different ways to different people and adapt and assimilate while hanging on to your heritage and while being American. And so this is all concepts I think that people wrestle with being in the in-between. And I feel like what you've done is you found a way to embrace that. So what advice can you give when it comes to never feeling like one thing, but being truly like a bridge and to really embrace what being Filipino American is?
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break to ask a quick question and share some exciting news. If you could have anyone on the show, who would it be? How meaningful has it been to have a podcast featuring Filipinas on the rise? I love putting this show together and I would love you to partner with me on sustaining the show. We now have a Patreon account where you can pledge $1, $3, or $5 a month to help keep the show going. As a supporter, you will get a Filipina on the Rise sticker, a personal shout out on the end of the show, and you can make direct requests for guests and more. Your financial support would go directly to things like better recording equipment, getting even better guests, and more content. Your support also means that you are part of the mission to elevate Filipina excellence around the world. Please visit at patreon.com/Filipina on the Rise, and the link is also on the show notes. Okay, now back to the show.
What advice can you give when it comes to never feeling like one thing, but being truly like a bridge?
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge like the notion of being in between, right? I mean, in many ways you are literally, but like, why can't you be both? I don't think anybody has really pushed that question enough, pushed back, right? Like, why can't you be more than one thing? Because in many ways, when you think about it as a person, we occupy multiple spaces at the same time, but yet we live in a world that demands like binary spaces, right? And I'm like, but wait a minute, like, okay, I'm a woman, but I'm also a woman of color. I'm a Filipina. I'm a journalist. I'm a daughter. I'm a cousin to somebody, like, so that's more than two, so like, it doesn't, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's a weird, I don't think people have kind of grasped the concept of it, but
well, well, it's also like the structure of things. There's very linear. I go back to what you said about non-linear, and that's just sometimes we look at it and think it means it's confused, or like the essence of it means like wandering or directionless, but actually non-linear is a path that people can take and actually thrive in. And that's what you have done. And so we live in the structure that there is a linear way to certain things if you're in med school or if you're working up the corporate ladder. And so I think that when we start to look at, growth as being able to be nonlinear, then that's when people can really thrive. So I want to kind of go back to when you talked about like being in a career path that felt nonlinear. Did you ever like navigating through, you worked at so many different places like CNN or CBS News, Vice News. Did you know that where you're at, it was a little bit nonlinear and you just kind of pushed through it anyways? Or were you just looking ahead of you at the next best thing? And what was your own strategy with career growth and feeling like things were nonlinear?
It depended, right? So I think In the beginning, there was a path, right? Because I chose print. Okay, so this is what I need to do to climb up this. But then around 2008, I kind of saw the writing on the wall. I'm like, okay, I got to get out of print because this is not really doing well. So, I went to like online, and online was still pretty new. Like, we didn't know what was going on. So it was still kind of a wild, wild west. And then I just kind of kept going with it. And ultimately, it got me to New York. And when the linear path just couldn't get me to where I wanted to go because of, either there were people ahead of me or for whatever other reasons, I wasn't going to be able to move in that role. I just decided to just take my own destiny in my hand and just like take a risk. Right. And that was the beginning of just going with it. And I went to a startup, and then, as the startups are, they restructured after about 5 months. So that was like the first kind of wave of like, oh my God, what's going on? And that really became nonlinear. I'm like, now what do I do? But ultimately, like, if that had not happened, I don't think I would have been able to work at places like CBS or Vice in the interim before I found my next role, which, in looking back in my career, I realized in most of the places I worked at, I've usually been the first one in those roles. Like they've been new roles. And I realized that's where I thrive the best, when there are new roles, because I can really truly shape it the way I want. I have no predecessor for them to like compare me to. And I think some people might see that as terrifying. And certainly like in my latest role, I think there was a little bit of that. But then I realized that, if I am scared, that's actually a good thing, because I know that I'm growing, So like, to me, I kind of just reframed the whole thing. Instead of being scared as negative, being scared is actually a good thing, because I'm actually learning something new versus, you know what I mean? Versus doing the same thing.
Exactly. So you were able to basically reframe the feeling of being scared as something that excited you and actually equated growth for you. Yeah. That's really interesting. That's almost like reclaiming the feeling of fear, right? And turning it into something that pushes you and excites you. I look at your background and I almost see that you were in a space and industry that was always evolving and always changing, and maybe might have been tumultuous. And so you had to keep evolving with that, if that feels accurate. And so what was inside of you that kept pushing through with all these changes? And I want to know if there was any cultural aspects that you felt played a role, whether positive or negative, as you journeyed through this ever-evolving industry in your career.
Yeah, in many ways, I kind of like to look at it. Well, there's two things. I would say I'm just very stubborn. I refuse to give up. Like, you'd have to really I will not stop until I know that there's no way further I can go. But in many ways, I feel like I just played it as a Filipino. Like, Filipinos are always adaptable, right? Like, and I just realized that like more recently, I'm like, oh my God, I am Filipino, but I've been a Filipino the whole time.
You've been Filipino this whole time.
Right. I went Filipino, you know what I mean? Because like, who's more adaptable than us? Like, let's be real. Like, we are literally diasporic people. Like, you can find us everywhere.
Stick us in a random country, we'll find a way to...
Right. And why? Because we want to survive. We're not doing it just for us. I mean, yes, part of it is just for us, like ourselves, but like for the greater Kapwa, like our community, our family, like there's no choice. It is the choice. Right. So, yeah. But
I also see there's like vigor in there, and there's ability to be an optimist instead of like, oh, surviving. It's more of like this, like a positive outlook that I feel is unique to us. Do you feel like that is consistent, even with how you ventured onwards, and is consistent with our own, like how we are able to be resilient in this way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously it's different for person to person. I think there is a segment of the community where we are still in survival mode when we should really be moving towards thriving, right? Because it's like, yes, our older generation has set the foundation. They took the first risk coming here. But like, I think we're ready to make that next step of like, let's move away from survival and really go like living a life that's like thriving. and not worrying about like surviving the day to day, but really living life. And I think that's probably the next step. Yeah.
I know that we talked briefly about like intergenerational trauma and just like this fear of taking risks. Do you think those kind of tie in to that hesitation of like going into thriving mode?
I think so. And, look, there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, like that's always going to be a concern, right? Like, ultimately we're very emotional people. We really feel deep in our emotions. And like, of course we want the best for our families and friends. So we want them to be safe, but safe doesn't mean like not taking a risk either. I think, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's really reframing that. Like sometimes safe is really leaving, and doing something else. Like, I think, you know what I mean? I think it's more dangerous to be safe than why not try something?
We're going to now cover a project that Leezel is working on called the Blood Debt Project Series. Here she explores the concept of owing debt transcending finances, like time, love, and existence. We always say blood is thicker than water, and in Filipino culture specifically, we are taught to feel like we owe the generations before us in exchange for the sacrifices they made. We owe our debt to our ancestors who have somehow put us together. This is what she explores in her Blood Debt Project series. The discovery happened when at 25, Leezel's life took a turn and she was all of a sudden taking care of different family matters and became an accidental homeowner. The story begins like this. Her parents divorced in 1997, and as part of that, they were supposed to sell the house she grew up in Southern California, but they never did for some reason, and her mom continued to live there. Issue loomed over her and her mom for the next decade as her mother worked the night shift to put her through school and pay off the house, but she always knew that one day her absentee father would come back for his share of the house. And he did. Leezel was already graduated from college and into her first job, and her father reappears to reclaim the house and sell it because he needed the money. She tries to talk to her father, who, mind you, she had no contact with him for almost a decade.
And I was like, all right, well, let me see if I could talk to him and see maybe he might just let this go. Because at this point, I really had no contact with him. He never paid like child support, all that. So I get a hold of him and he's like, well, I'm coming back for the house because I need the money. I was like, okay. He says the thing that I will never forget, which is essentially the heart and genesis of this story and project, was like, well, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't be here. So I was just like, okay. Once he said that, I was like, all right, let me just go back to my mom. And I just said, look, let's just buy him out because he's just not going to stop. But, that really, that stayed with me for a while because I was just like, well, first of all, I did not ask to be here, but I am here,
And now this feeling of indebtedness.
Yeah, I mean, he literally basically dropped utang and loob, like debt of gratitude, right?
All right, hold on tight for some numbers ahead. Leezel applied for a 30-year mortgage to cover her father's share plus any outstanding debts they had incurred, including her student loans. The house had appraised at $400,000. Her monthly mortgage payment became almost $2,000. The deed of the home was transferred to Leezel, her mom and uncle, closing the chapter of life involving her father. While she also got rid of some family debt, it opened another debt chapter in her life, where she was paying for a majority of the mortgage, if not all of it. After that, Leezel made the move to New York City to embark on her own independent career life, as any normal 25-year-old would do. However, picture being a 25-year-old paying for a mortgage from your family plus your own rent. How did you get here? Now picture navigating this under the pretense that you essentially are indebted to your family and have to take care of all this. Sound familiar? Maybe not for you, but this is actually something common passed down intergenerationally for many Filipino families. This feeling of what we call utang na loob was so strong to Leezel. She knew she couldn't be the only one and eventually proposed its story. Here's how it made it to CNN Money.
Like when I was at CNN Money, the editors were looking for stories about, because they were doing a series on millennials and their money. And they didn't want the same old story because, like there was a lot of negative stories about millennials, and they wanted other stories. So for whatever reason, I don't know what came over me. I was like, well, I have a story. I don't know if you guys want it. And then they're like, what is it? And I told them that. They're like, oh, yeah. And I was like, are you guys sure? Because this is really personal. I don't know if anybody's going to relate. They're like, no. Go ahead and write it. I did write it. And I was like, all right, I'm not sure, but here it is. They looked at it. They edited it. And, in many ways, like it was very cathartic, right? Because that was the first time I actually let it out in the world. And when it published, the other thing that was more surprising was the feedback. Like, the folks that were like children of immigrants, they immediately understood whether they were Filipino or not. They got it.
After that CNN article was published, Leezel said the story had haunted her since 2015 in a good way. It was nagging her like she needed to do something about it because it was hitting a nerve, especially for children of immigrants. So, in the summer of 2018, she went to a writing workshop where you could submit something in progress and others workshop it with you. Although she came in writing a completely different story, the group eventually discovered her mortgage story and encouraged her to keep focusing on it because it clearly hit a nerve and needed to be focused on this concept of blood debt.
So I rewrote the thing again, and the end of the workshop, they looked at it again, and the workshop leader's like, yes, this is the story you should be talking. You've already A/B tested this, right? Like you already know that this has hit a nerve, and this is the story you should really be telling. And ultimately, that workshop leader is the one that gave me the title of the entire project, because he was just like, he summed it up really well. It's like, yeah, because you're literally paying a blood debt. You're paying a mortgage, like an actual debt, but then it's also by blood because, with your dad and all. But then in many ways, it's my blood, sweat, and tears that I'm trying to pay this back. So I was like, oh my God. So when he said that, it was so chilling that I was like, yes, I need to do something with this. So that leads us to where I'm at with this.
So your project, and it's about to be released as a series, right?
So essentially my plan is to release it during Filipino American History Month. But yeah, I'm shooting for about to that. But looking at debt, like basically people's relationship to debt. So going beyond the financial, like the whole utang and loob, and also looking at different industries, because there's also this notion, like in the tech world, there's a notion of tech debt. If you're a performer, there's like, sweat equity that you're dealing with. And what does that mean? So there's a lot of threads to pull around this concept of debt, and who do you owe what, and do you owe it at all, And it's like a lot of these like bigger issues that as a community, we just don't talk about.
Through her Blood Debt series, Leezel hopes to begin the conversation that we're not having around debt, this concept of utang na loob being weaponized. Utang na loob is a concept in Filipino culture of one's obligations. Here, I asked Leezel to explain it.
So it roughly translates to debt of gratitude. So it's a very deep Filipino value. I think it's even pre-colonial. I mean, don't quote me on that, but that it's this notion of like very much like your obligations to family. Like in many ways, you have a debt to your parents because they brought you into this world, right? Or you're indebted to somebody if they do something for you, right? It's that whole notion of like you owe someone and all that, and you got to pay it back. Sure. I think regardless if you're Filipino or not, I think the stories that you'll be hearing in this series, they're just going to resonate.
What are you hoping to accomplish for the individual, either Filipino or just a basic listener, by really being exposed to this? And is there anything that you're hoping to free someone from?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I want people to know they're not alone in this. Because, like, I think for me, I thought I was alone in, like, my story, right? People like basically just reaching out and saying, thank you for telling this. Like, I thought I was the only one that was dealing with something like this. And to me, that is just so powerful. And it just re-energized and reignited my core again, like as a storyteller, of just the power of that. So
yeah, exactly. It reaffirms the work you're doing. Just that phrase. And I have actually gotten that sometimes when I feel like giving up because I don't know if the work is relevant or if it matters. Just that simple phrase, message, thank you for sharing this. I thought I was the only one. And there's something so powerful about pulling somebody out of this feeling of isolation or irrelevance or not being understood and putting them into like, hey, like you're not the only one who's dealt with this. You can be like affirmed in your experience, and we're all in this together. Like there's just really something so moving about hearing that phrase. Like I thought I was the only one. Thank you for putting this out there.
Yeah, and it goes back to the like it's just so powerful when you feel like you've been seen and heard, especially coming from a community that's just never really in the mainstream. You know,
exactly. I totally agree with that. And then lastly, if you had a message to send to Filipino women, what would it be?
So it's going to sound cheesy because I'm going to steal this from a movie, but I think it rings true and it really, really resonated with me. So this is from Crazy Rich Asians. It was in the opening. It was in the opening scene in the classroom talking about game theory. ultimately, it's reframing everything. Instead of playing not to lose, we should be playing to win. Like when that line came up, I was like, oh my God. And I just realized all these past couple years, I've been playing not to lose when I really should have been playing to win, you
Win.
know, play to
Wow.
win. Yeah. So like, I think once you kind of reclaim that, I think you start to realize things start to change and like things fall into place. So
Oh,
like,
and then you're putting yourself on the offense, not the defense anymore.
yes, that's
And it's exactly
super
what you
powerful.
said, full circle from surviving to thriving. Oof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Playing to win and not to lose. Now, isn't that a reminder that feels so necessary and relevant, especially nowadays? The world has drastically changed since we first sat down. Leezel and I recorded this in the beginning of February, and we reconnected recently to record this last part. The global pandemic has changed everything, from public health, the economy, and our basic way of living and interacting. Since then, tragically, 3 more Black lives have been taken at the hands of police brutality, highlighting our present realities of racial injustice. This tragedy has reignited more protests nationwide, crying for justice, Black Lives Matter, and systemic reform. We discuss these current events, her own lens and insights as a Bridge journalist, and the different forms of activism we as individuals can take and our Filipino American community can take, and how we can move forward with hope. So, Leezel, the last time we talked was before quarantine lockdown. Like, how would you say your own landscape has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we even talked, before the pandemic, reached the pinnacle, things were already changing, but not at the rapid pace that it is now. I think the words that keep popping up in this whole thing that's been happening to everyone is just like unprecedented. Everything's
The
been
amount of times
everything.
you have seen that word.
To the point that it's like, oh my gosh, is that really the right word for this? And in many ways it is, because like I don't think I could ever recall, at least in my lifetime and probably in many people's lifetime, to be, first of all, in a pandemic. I mean, you always read about it in like history and science books, but never to this level. So it's kind of crazy that in modern times that this is happening. And then on top of that, all the other things that happen usually on a cyclical like time period, right? I mean, I think there was already talks that we're overdue for a recession and the economy dropping and whatnot. So I think we're already seeing some of that coming into play even prior to this, but even more so now. A lot of the things that the pandemic has brought on has just more like just amplified a lot of inequalities that already existed before. So none of this should actually be a surprise, but in many ways for a lot of folks that actually haven't been paying attention, it is a surprise. So I kind of like to look at it as an opportunity to like finally, okay, people, there's no way you cannot ignore this anymore, that this, this is what we've been trying to tell you guys that it's been happening. But like, now it's like, well, there's no place to go at this point. I mean, literally, there's no place you can go. Everyone's at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Or wherever they are. It feels like we're suspended in time. So in a weird way, it's like, you cannot not ignore this anymore.
Exactly.
It's
I like that you highlight that, because in the beginning of quarantine, it was this whole feeling of we're all in this together, we're unite, like these positive feelings of solidarity, and then not, because it did start highlighting, emphasizing where there have been longstanding racial inequalities, and those being even more deepened, I would say, or where you see that communities of color are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic and economic changes. I did see that you posted something on your Twitter regarding like Black communities asking for testing centers or demanding those, and that not being distributed equally. Do you have any like thoughts around how communities of color have been disproportionately affected?
Yeah, you mean around COVID or just in general?
Around COVID. I mean, for like yes, I mean in general, and then with this as a layer, just even showing more the disparities, the haves and have-nots, and racial inequalities.
Yeah, I mean, they have been massively disproportionately affected. And I think what you're seeing now is more of an eye towards that, which I'm glad it's finally getting some coverage. But in many ways, it's almost disheartening to see that, because it's like we're in the year 2020, and this is still the conversation that's happening right now, just even even for just basic services, like that's still such a problem. And the fact that like there was no infrastructure, or if the infrastructure was in place, it wasn't implemented in time to help remedy some of the after effects of this. So I think for me, at least for the role that I play just in general with my career, I feel like I'm not necessarily quote unquote on the front lines in that definition, but I feel like I'm sort of adjacent to that, and that's where I think, you know, being able to amplify these voices and information around this is super important to me personally, and for folks that are in roles like mine to do. Because, and I don't know about you, especially I just speaking like within my own peer group and the community that I'm around, it's like you see a lot more of this information not getting to the people that should be reading it, and even within our own community, because of, you know, the spread of misinformation and like fake news, which
echo
is
chambers,
super dangerous, and it's super siloed and all that.
That's the
So
most frustrating part. And do you see that more blatantly from your end?
yeah, I mean, it was already there beforehand. I
Yeah.
think the 2016 election season is a great example of that. I think even if you look back at that whole year itself, you can kind of see the signals already happening. And again, like this stuff is not a new thing. Like fake news and misinformation,
Yeah.
disinformation has been used around the world in different you know, situations in government and whatnot. But like if you do like a case study of just like 2016, and you kind of look at the news cycle and what has been put out there, and also the chain of events that have happened, I mean, like it's just it's crazy when you to think about like how fast misinformation can just spread. And you know,
Yeah.
things like social media help become the
Yeah.
platform for that. And what
Yeah.
I fear the most in that is just our folks in our communities, our lolos and titas and titos and all those folks that are susceptible to that.
Yeah.
So, and simply by not even having a malintent, you know, like I think
And it
in
just
many
shows up on
ways.
their feed, and if they're like
Yeah.
watching it, it keeps going. It's this echo chamber. I that's exactly what's happening, and you almost can't blame them for getting all the like the most intense extreme versions of it and then forming their view of it based on that. Well, it's like those outlets are showing like violent scenes, and it's like fear mongering, and so that's what
Yeah, and
yeah,
ultimately, I think, you know, in many ways, for a lot of us, we feel helpless at this time. What can we
exactly.
do? So, in some people inadvertently share things that are actually more harmful. You know, like
Yeah.
I think the intent is not necessarily there in folks
Yeah.
within our community. But I always like to think like, you know, like in the start of the pandemic, there's been this huge campaign around washing your hands for 20 seconds, washing your hands for 20 seconds, right? And absolutely, like you should have been doing that beforehand, but apparently people were not. So you know, there's that. But like I think that message kept getting pounded across, like just not just us in general, but in like everyone else. But
Mhm.
I wonder, why can't we do the same thing for misinformation? It's like, just like
Mm.
you would always wash your hands for 20 seconds, we should also, you know, practice good information hygiene. And that a lot of that starts from like taking the time and taking a pause, like thinking before you share that link.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things to me, what it has in the last couple of months, what it has revealed to me is that like, I guess there's just not enough media literacy, and there's not enough critical thinking
Mhm.
being, I guess, disseminated or thought of. Like I'm trying
Yeah.
to remember, like when I was in college and like in school,
Yeah.
did they actually teach us that? I mean, and maybe, but not so explicitly. And I think in this age it's even more so, because it could mean between life and death. You know, some of the
Yeah.
things I saw like floating around during the height of like when the lockdowns are happening with COVID, it's like all these like tips that like, you know, you should gargle with like whatever water that's going to kill the virus. I'm like, whoa, why is this
So
being
much.
shared? There's
I
no
know.
like scientific evidence. So it's so
Mhm.
dangerous, you know? And I think that is the one
Mhm.
thing that has definitely something that is now we are forced to face head on. Like it's always been there, but I
Yeah.
think from my standpoint, it's running rampant, and that is terrifying to see that,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
So yeah.
So so you recently posted, I think it was a quote by Lindsay Young, and it says, "Resistance is not a one-lane highway." Your lane could be protesting, organizing, counseling, activism, surviving the day, but don't feel guilty for not occupying every lane. We need all of them. So you as Leezel Tanglao, and you have really identified as a bridge journalist and being in, I feel like that's like literally in so many lanes. And like, do you feel like being a bridge journalist is playing an even bigger and more significant role now? And how would you define your lane in this?
Yeah, I think 100%. And I think that's part of the reason when I saw that quote, it really resonated with me. Because like, again, like there's only 24 hours in a day. And you can only do so much, but at the same time, you can do something, you could do a lot,
Yeah.
in those 24 hours. But what I realize is that like, you don't have to be everywhere, because once
Yeah.
you try to if you try to like kind of double down in that mindset, you don't get anything done. I feel like what's more impactful is taking a beat and looking at the bigger picture. And again, not everybody thinks differently, everybody has a different way of approaching things. What I realized in the last couple of months, and especially being in the current role that I'm in, being in strategy and innovation, it really revealed something to myself that I didn't realize, that actually this is my wheelhouse in terms of like
Mhm.
taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and seeing where the connections, where does it make sense, to double down certain efforts, and being really, I think the word that keeps coming up in my mind is being intentional with
Yeah.
every action I take. As a journalist, it's kind of a fine line in terms of like, do I go out there to protest or am I
Yeah.
covering it? So every company has a different policy and it gets a little sticky there. But at the same time, I think I know what my role is. And I think for a lot of people, it's tough, especially when you're kind of in this identity formation phase of your life. You don't know where you are. I think for me, I think just growing older and whatnot, maybe I have that gift of hindsight, not being afraid to like double down and embracing like what your role is,
Yeah.
and not like
It
feeling bad that you don't get to do everything.
it's
But
so hard though. Like you go on social media, any online platforms, and everyone's saying something about it. Everyone's giving so many suggestions and recommendations how to be an effective ally, how to be in solidarity. If you're not doing this, you're not speaking up, you're being silent. And like, I bring it back to thinking about the community that's hurting and like, okay, it's not about us, it's about this issue. There's a community that's hurting, whether it was, before this all happened, there was the anti-Asian like sentiment happening. And then now we have this focus around anti-Blackness and fighting that. And to me, I get so like, as a person who runs a brand and a platform, I'm like, which angle do I take? Like, there's so many avenues and it's like overwhelming. And I feel like a lot of people are feeling that overwhelm right now about like, which role do we play? Do I play as an individual? Where do I start? Like, I feel helpless. I've heard that a lot because I can't really make an impact, and there's so much. And so because there's so much, like maybe there's this like feeling of like helplessness or like being paralyzed. So how would you advise or encourage people to think about their role in this, individuals? And maybe we can talk about specifically like our community, when the Filipino or Asian American community.
yeah, I mean, I get it, because I feel like there are some days that I feel like I'm not doing enough. So they're certainly not alone. I think for sure. And I also do think that just like COVID-19,
Yeah.
the pandemic, what we're experiencing now with the anti-Blackness, racism, and whatnot, and a bunch of other things that have been happening. I
Yeah.
mean, this is not going to be over anytime soon.
Mm,
So it's almost thinking about it both on the short term and long term, like
yeah.
approaches, right? And I think sometimes, there is a need that we have to do something now. And
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you. I absolutely do not disagree with you. Um, but I also think like this is not going to be solved over a day either. So
Mm,
there are many ways that
this
you
is
can help in
yeah.
whatever way that is, in whatever industry you're in, whatever that is. So, and it's also, I think, something that only that person could answer. And
Yeah.
I think I like what you said, and I was going to say something to that effect, that like it's not about necessarily you, it's about this community,
Yeah.
and like how do we support them as who we are, and because we are also a marginalized community, but Black community is also
It's in a different
It's a
level.
different
For
level,
sure.
right?
There's different historic undertones to this. And
Yeah.
I do agree with you that we have to remember we're in this for the long game. Like it's not going to be solved in like a few months. And the more we think that our actions will need to produce a solution that's in the short term, I think that's where it can be overwhelming. So maybe like what I'm hearing from you is like being really, really realistic that this is going to be more of a long term fight. I guess that sounds really aggressive, but it's like change happens. The best change, I think, is the ones that are like not slow and steady,
Maybe consistent, right? Because
consistent.
it's
Yeah.
like, again, like you can't expect things to happen overnight. I mean, there probably some like exceptions to that, but in general, bigger, longer systemic changes do
Yeah.
not happen overnight. They
Yeah.
happen in these consistent steps, intentional
Right.
actions that you have to take. And
Mhm.
oftentimes, if you really want to make sure that happens, you do have to take a beat and like take a step back and strategize what makes sense, and
Yeah.
where can you as a person, as an organization, can best contribute to a movement, to some action being taken, so that you can maximize the most impact, right? Because ultimately, I think
Mm.
that's what everybody's kind of feeling most anxious about. Like, how can I help? Like everyone, I don't think there's ever, unless you're like from you're going the other extreme, um,
Yeah.
that everybody wants to help in some way. But I think where things kind of get a little foggy is like, well, they don't know how. So I think we're
Mhm.
kind of in that phase now, like how do we help, but like
Yeah.
I do think that it's a longer term play, and every day becomes a question of like picking your battles. Is it worth
Yeah.
picking your battles on this, or do I have to do this other thing because I know in the longer run it's actually going to help move
Yeah.
the needle, and ultimately what needs to happen is a longer, a lot of these things,
Yeah.
it's tied to systems that have been just tied to a lot of this disparity and
Totally.
inequality, so
Yeah.
that's going to take longer to do
Right.
change.
On that, I've always been the type of like I guess activist that wants to be on the ground, and that's how I feel like I'm making change when I'm holding up the sign and like kind of in front of like news cameras and stuff. But it's like now that we're in quarantine and we have to think about what our allyship and our activism looks like in this context. When you mentioned that we have to really think about like what context am I in as an individual? Like I feel it's almost best to start of like with yourself, kind of giving yourself a check. Like as a Filipino American, okay, have I researched enough about these issues? Like what have I been conditioned to believe, and how do I influence conversations with my family? And I want to know if you have any I guess, ideas or things to promote around what other forms of activism can look like at this time of like quarantine, and especially for like Filipino Americans, where like we can start thinking about the role our community plays in context of anti-Black.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been a lot of conversations with a lot of my peers and friends that we've been having the last couple of days. It's like, what do we do? How can we make sure we are showing support to
Yeah.
certain things? Because it's like, again, we know what it's like to be a minority and
Mm-hmm.
to be a community that's often invisible. Just even ancestral history back in the motherland and all those events that happened there. I think
Yeah.
depending on what people are comfortable with, and off the bat, like you see people that are protesting for sure, right? There's that, and then there's also, I think, just taking a step back and like listening to the Black community and asking them what they need the most. And what I've
Mm-hmm.
heard a lot from them is amplifying their voices,
Yeah.
which is not surprising, but I think maybe it's surprising for some people, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, oftentimes I think the assumption is the impulse is to be physically out there, and I think that's also a great thing, right? To even
Mm-hmm.
see visually that support is very powerful, but also to hear them even say, like, just to be amplifying their voices, that just goes back to the power of storytelling. And
Yes.
for folks that are in this kind of space, like, again, like after being told that or like not necessarily seen as in the same value as the traditional, like, you know, doctor, lawyer, whatever.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a sort of validation that, like, okay, this is important, just as important as all those other professions.
Absolutely.
Right? Because it's like a lot of what, as a storyteller, a lot of what we do, like, it's in many ways, it's like it's everlasting.
I know what you
Not that the
mean.
other stuff isn't, but like you are essentially recording a lot of this history that needs to be preserved so that future generations or whatever are like, God forbid this doesn't happen again, we're not at this level, that there is a record.
And
And
it's
you know,
just as important. It's like storytelling and reporting. It's something that we've lacked in our own history for so long. So now that's actually something we talked about during the original podcast, that you felt your mission was to let voices that are not usually heard, be told. That's where I just saw so much relevance right now. Yesterday was Blackout Tuesday, and it was all about us muting and stopping and listening so that, you know, the Black community can have themselves amplified.
yeah, like now that you reminded me of that, it's like, I feel like we did talk about this. The fact that they keep emphasizing amplifying their voices, to me, is just is a validation of, like, you know, yes, this is, of course, this is what we've been trying to do, but even more so, here's an opportunity for us, as storytellers, as well as even just the Filipino community, to show solidarity with this community that's hurting right now. And this is absolutely something that is very, I think, low lift to help amplify their voices. You know, if people are not comfortable like going out there and protesting, I mean, everyone has a Facebook at the very least, or something, or like social media, or even not that, at least even breaching the conversation with family, which is very, I think, going to be very uncomfortable.
Ooh,
And
I'm actually
I
gonna have
don't know.
next episode talking about that, about how do we shape the dialogue and start to dismantle anti-Blackness and racism within the
Yeah.
conversations and dialogue happening within Filipino families. And I'm like, oh my
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had a script to that too, because I don't know either. But I do think, and I know a lot of my friends and peers are having the same exact conversation, and it's been very uncomfortable. But, you know, to me, I think in many ways, even though it is uncomfortable, at least we're breaching the topic instead of not talking about it at all. And I think that to me is like the one step forward, you know?
No, because it's so important that we start within ourselves and our own community, and being very real about what a history of oppression and, I guess, like, white supremacy has done to our own psyche. So that being said, for you as a Filipina, I don't know what, storyteller, bridge journalist. I'm trying to find the right title for you, but I realize you have many titles, and I can't just limit, like, put you in a box like that. But what do you really want to promote as a message of hope in this time?
Oh man. I mean, I think there's multiple messages. I think it's taking it day by day. I mean, I'm thankful every time I see a sunrise and a sunset, you know, like I made it another day. And to me, that's another opportunity to do something. And tying everything back to like kind of full circle, I was also like interviewed at another podcast a couple of weeks ago. And one of the questions that were posed, I don't quite remember, but something around like, do you think your identity as a Filipina or Filipino has helped shape kind of like what you do now and who you are? And I think what I had said at the time, and I think it also applies in this instance, that absolutely you can't separate that. You just can't. And I think for me, it being a Filipino and having this really rich heritage and knowing where you come from, it really adds a lot of layers to kind of what I'm currently at and what I'm doing, and being proud of that too, because like in many ways, we as a people are, and maybe we've forgotten this, I don't know. We as a people are used to a lot of chaotic change. Like in many ways, we are like this is what I said, like we are like the original OG innovators when you think about it, right? Because like we've gone through so many like colonization regimes and whatnot, but you know what? We're still here. We are stubborn. We don't give up. We are still here because you know why? Because we innovate, because we adapt, we pivot, and we're still here. So I think it's in many ways, it's like, can we tap into that very ancestral, deep kind of cultural heritage and lineage that we come from, and not be, and it's, again, being afraid, of course, it's all human nature and whatnot, but also not forgetting like who we are and where we came from. Like it is uncertain, it's terrifying, I don't know what's going to happen next, but you know what, no one else does either. So I think we're not at a point that, if this is like a game of chess, we're not at checkmate yet, we are far from checkmate. So I think, you know, can like, this is why I, like, for me, what I realized, it's been, again, another breakthrough for me. It's like, oh my God, this is like, why didn't I realize that this is what like my wheelhouse is? It's like, and this is where you go back to the bridge stuff. It's like finding, like, taking the step back. I mean, I can go granular, but I can also go like far, like big picture, and seeing where everything connects, and being literally a bridge to people. Like, if I can't do it directly, I can certainly help connect them with the sources they need and whatnot. And I know a lot of people fulfill that role as well. And sometimes maybe they just need to be encouraged. Maybe they just need to be aware of that. And I think as Filipinos, especially Filipino Americans, if you grew up in, you know, your parents immigrated here, you kind of already are a bridge person. You may not realize it, right? So once you do, why not embrace that? I mean, it is difficult, but then it's also, again, I go back to being uncomfortable prompts you to grow. So I think, why not embrace everything, even as uncomfortable as it is, and embrace the great lineage. Anyways, the great lineage that you come from.
Heritage. Absolutely. I love that. That is so good. It makes me feel like, exactly what you said, like, this is in our blood. I've never thought about our people and the adjective innovators. And I love that you say that, because it's giving me a different look on the role that we play, because we always say like, oh, we adapt and we know how to assimilate, and it just sounds so like passive sometimes. But like, innovator is like, it's creative. You are like, you're thinking outside of the box, and like, I love it. It's empowering.
I think I said it earlier in our first interview, right? How do we switch over to thriving, right? And innovation, I think, sometimes gets miscategorized. And again, I go back to like, how do we take back the narrative and redefine a lot of these terms? Because like being an innovator or innovation doesn't mean you have to completely start with something new. Sometimes it's really like building upon the foundation that's already there, and like looking at it from a different approach. So that's why I feel like, why can't we embrace, like, we are like the original innovators in many ways. Like, how many wars have we been through? How many regime changes, and like martial law, and God knows what else. And we're all over the world, you know, like, we're not just in the Philippines, we're everywhere. We're truly a diasporic people, but we've survived. We will not have survived if we did not employ certain tactics and innovations and pivots. Right. So it's in many ways, it's kind of a reframing of it in, I guess, more positive way. Right.
That gives so much hope, I think, to the way to look at all this. And I've just been really gravitating to like, what's a hopeful lens? What's a hopeful framework? Always so good having your perspective and you representing us on these forefronts of storytelling. So appreciate you, and thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Feel free to leave a comment about what you thought. And if you haven't yet, follow on Instagram at Filipina on the Rise. I hope to see you and hear from you there. Thanks, everyone.